But before I dive into the particulars of my work, I was inspired by almost 9 years of work in college admissions at Penn and Princeton, and by my experience coordinating a partnership with an organization devoted to getting more low-income students into selective institutions. I want to give you just one context slide about the landscape of social mobility and higher education. And you may see this slide again. Some of you may, in fact, be familiar with it. This is from Professor Raj Chetty's 2017 study, Mobility Report Cards, the role of colleges in intergenerational mobility. And if you haven't looked at it, I strongly recommend it. So if you're here, it's a safe bet you care about social mobility, or in this educational context, the fraction of students who come from families in the bottom income quintile and reach the top quintile. Stanford professor Raj Chetty's access to anonymized tax records has told us a great deal. So this figure from his study plots the relationship between children's and parents' income ranks, conditional on which college a child attends for college in 3 different tiers. Right? But the top is the elite colleges, then we're talking about middle tier colleges, and then we're talking about community colleges with the colored dots. The gray circles represent the relationship on a national level between parent and child income rank, and the colored circles illustrate how an education actually flattens that line, showing that children from low income and high income families who attend colleges in the same tier have very similar earnings outcomes, and representing that a college education actually disrupts the relationship between parent and child income. Though my research was not focused explicitly on social mobility, I think there are lessons to be learned, specifically about how we should think about partnerships for social mobility. Given the short nature of our time together, I'm just going to focus on the broad strokes of my study rather than do a deep dive. Okay, so my dissertation was a mixed method study that asked the questions that you see here, basically how common are relationships between colleges and nonprofits for college access, how do institutions understand them and use them to achieve particular goals, so I did focus on the institutions, not on the nonprofits, and what motivates institutions to engage in and sustain these relationships. So my aim in this topic was to actually be useful, above all things. I wanted it to be a means to generate some knowledge about an area of practice that we don't really understand particularly well, particularly among non-elite institutions. There are a lot of studies of, the Princetons of the world. And I wanted there also to be implications for practice. So as an important note, by typical, I mean moderately selective and inclusive higher education institutions, which I refer to as HEIs for the sake of time. So just as a side note, the 171 HEIs that are considered highly selective in the US typically serve less than 10% of high school graduates by most estimates. So the frameworks I used, probably not terribly interesting, but they came from business, specifically theories about why companies choose to form relationships with one another. So I was interested in whether this literature could be cross-applied. So these are the basic headlines there. I had the idea that colleges and universities would be interested in learning from nonprofits about some of the things that nonprofits that do college access do well. And I'm not really going to talk too much about what happened there, but they didn't really learn much. Let's just put it that way. Sorry. So this also is another slide that you can't see, sorry. But basically I conducted hour-long interviews with 30 individuals at 25 different 4-year nonprofit Pennsylvania-based colleges and universities, public and private, with a focus on moderately selective institutions. I spoke with deans of admission and directors and even some presidents, and I used the federal data to get a little bit of background. I'm sorry, it's so tiny. So the qualitative findings, really the quant findings aren't that relevant for you in this particular context, so I'll stick to the qualitative. What I found was that the central terms in the study, both relationship and college access organization, were really fuzzy for people. They truly did, they were like, what do you mean by relationship? What do you mean by college access organization? This could be once yearly contact, the ability to pick up the phone to talk to a trusted colleague, or the presence of an MOU or contract. All those things were a relationship. 18 of the institutions I spoke to, again I spoke to 25, had relationships of some kind, 7 had nothing. Those that had relationships gave me 120 different responses. 120 individual responses representing 97 different nonprofit organizations. There's not a lot of repeat, only 15 were repeated. In general, what I found was that city schools that are moderately selective, private, and relatively small were those that were most likely to have partnerships. And colleges often saw their relationships with nonprofits as like a community service thing, which we can talk about separately. I have thoughts on that. But there were some benefits to these relationships. I'm not going to go into too much details there, but college access organizations were generally understood to be anything at all that performs any function that might be useful for college, which is a very broad definition. So this is, tutoring and scholarship dollars, test prep, application help, developing social skills, anything you can think of. And there were a huge number of different kinds of organizations that fell into this: charter school networks, churches, scholarship granting organizations that do nothing but scholarship dollars. And importantly, a stated intent to form partnerships among colleges and universities did not actually lead to partnerships. So institutions generally believed that relationships with nonprofits could do some of these things, right? Improve access and to students for them, develop a pipeline, increase student diversity, improve retention. And these were mostly but not completely aligned with the things that colleges and universities believed NPOs could help them accomplish. There was a focus on generating access, trust, and education when institutions were asked about what relationships can do for them. So most people ultimately that I spoke to indicated, perhaps unwittingly, that relationships between their organizations and another were really just personal ties masquerading as institutional ones. And these can be really effective if in highly unsystematic ways. Personal ties were seen to catalyze and sustain relationships between organizations, even in the face of a perceived lack of success. Moreover, they can be carried from institution to institution, as people move on to the next job or the next institution. But on the flip side, any benefits of these kind of loose institutional ties in sheep's clothing, to put it that way, can be undermined by staff turnover, deeply undermined by staff turnover, owing to their lack of systematicness. Right, so amazingly, nobody collected any data. Does that amaze any of you? Probably not. Of 18 institutions with relationships, only 6 engaged in evaluation of any kind. And we're talking about like head counting, 1, 2, 3. We're not talking about analysis. We're talking about adding. And only 6 had ended any relationships at all due to whatever they called ineffectiveness. So maybe not enough applicants of the right kind, or failure to nurture, like I couldn't get along with my counterpart. So they let the organization lose a tie to another organization because one person couldn't get along with another, which is a shame. So notably, whether relationships were paid or unpaid, they were expected to deliver results. But note that we don't measure anything, tellingly. So in essence, these really aren't relationships. That's like the first major finding. These are loose dyadic linkages. If you look at the academic literature, that's what they're called, loose dyadic linkages. And the essence is that while colleges talked about efficiency, so spending fewer hours or dollars to achieve a hoped-for result, they mostly failed to measure anything at all. And within the context of my chosen framework, which I had up on the slides earlier, this finding suggests that legitimacy, right, appearances to some effect, are the main aim of these relationships. We want to look like we're doing something to address issues of diversity or access, or insert interesting word here. It's tough to claim you have a goal to say nothing of actually achieving it efficiently when nothing gets measured. So if we place these results in the larger landscape, however, I think we can safely say that colleges don't actually want things to be just about appearances. I don't believe that is what they want. I just think it's quite fabulously difficult to make these relationships into more substantive, impactful efforts. So things like money, time, and measurement, as well as capacity, stand in the way, right? So the relevance to social mobility of this whole thing, I think partnerships are one way to enhance colleges' ability to act as agents or drivers of social mobility for students. Dr. Chetty's research tells us more about the characteristics of colleges that drive social mobility, right? If you look closely at that study, it's really, really interesting. It lists some great schools that move students from the lowest quintile to the top quintile, et cetera. And so this paper could likely inform some decisions about what NPOs would be most fruitful as partners, right? How do we do the matching process? But in order to do this work, how we think about and execute partnerships itself needs to change. We need to look backward from a relatively narrow, measurable goal. And to me, this dissertation suggests that certain groups of institutions are actually ripe for partnership in a way that certain others aren't, because they've already opened themselves up to partnerships for other reasons, however ineffectual some of those partnerships might be. So I think that some of the prescriptions on the next slide may also be germane. right? Okay. So where does this leave us? We have several ideas. Okay. So institutions need to more clearly articulate their goals around enrollment so they can both attract and seek out nonprofits that can help them reach goals. And on the other side, nonprofits need to be clear about what they can actually do for students and by extension institutions. So what does success mean? The perpetual question. And on the value proposition side, what can nonprofits really deliver? And how does it differ from what other players are offering or could offer? And how do you know? Right? So the NPOs need to decide what the theory of action is and how we're actually changing people who come through our doors on a daily basis by what means, et cetera. How can we prove it? Critical question. And I also think that at a very basic level, there's a dire need for data and analytical fluency to be increased among folks everywhere. I think there's nobody that doesn't need more fluency with data, myself included. If we just count how many students come through the door, it's not going to help us much, right? So ultimately, I think organizations also need to forge stronger ties of a variety of kinds between one another, right? So research suggests, that transformational partnerships, those where partners actually enter into a relationship with the intent to transform as an organization, are much more effective at reaching their goals than those that are transactional, right? So we should seek to learn, in other words, at all times from our relationships with other organizations in order to change. This is sort of a throwaway slide, but you can just scroll down to the bottom and say, when I spoke to an admissions officer at an unnamed institution, this is what she had to say about why her institution did not have partnerships. Unfortunately, those type of feel-good things take a back seat. Scary. So, but what does that mean, right? It means how do we move relationships between organizations past feel-good? And sit down and really examine what that takes, right? And it's not the same thing for every set of organizations, but we can't let relationships between organizations come across as feel-good effort, right? That's pretty much the most important thing. So thanks.